Anthony stood in front of the tall glass building of Prestige Industries, his heart racing with excitement. He adjusted his suit, took a deep breath and walked in. This was his first day at work as an accountant, a job he had dreamed of since he graduated from the university. After years of studying, serving his country and applying for countless jobs, he had finally secured a position in one of the biggest companies in the city. The office was grand, filled with the sound of clicking keyboards, ringing phones and the quiet hum of printers. People walked past him in neatly pressed suits, each with an air of importance. As he stepped into the accounting department, a middle-aged man wearing a suit with glasses approached him. "You must be Anthony," the man said, offering a handshake. "I'm Mr. Benson, head of this department. Welcome to Prestige Industries." "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to be here," Anthony replied with a bright smile. Mr. Benson led him to his desk where a pile of documents awaited. "Your job is simple. Handle transactions, balance the accounts and make sure everything is accurate. We have high expectations, but I've heard great things about you." Anthony nodded. He was ready to prove himself. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Anthony worked tirelessly, ensuring every detail in the company's financial records was perfect. He stayed late to double-check figures, came in early to organize reports, and even assisted colleagues when they struggled with their work. His dedication did not go unnoticed. "Good work, Anthony," the CEO Mr. Edwards said one morning as he passed by. "You're one of the most hard-working employees we've had in years." "Thank you, sir," Anthony replied, feeling proud. Soon he became a well-respected figure in the company. He was earning well, driving a nice car and living in a comfortable estate. Life was finally looking up. But success often attracts enemies, and Anthony was no exception. At first it started with small things. Whispers behind his back, stolen files from his desk, cold stares from some of his colleagues. Anthony ignored it, choosing to focus on his work. But as time passed, the hostility grew stronger. One evening, as he was about to leave the office, two of his colleagues, Richard and Paul, approached him. "You've been working too hard, Anthony," Richard said with a forced smile. "Yeah," Paul added. "Maybe you should slow down a little. Nobody likes a show-off." Anthony frowned. "I'm just doing my job." "Sure," Richard said, his smile fading. "But remember, nobody stays at the top for too long." Anthony watched as they walked away, unease settling in his stomach. He had never been in a workplace filled with so much envy. But he refused to let it get to him. He would not let their bitterness ruin his dreams. As the months went by, Anthony's success continued. The CEO often called him to handle special projects, and his name was mentioned in high-profile meetings. He had earned the trust of top executives, which only made his colleagues hate him more. One evening, while Anthony was reviewing reports at his desk, his coworker, Grace, walked up to him. "Anthony," she said in a hushed tone. "Be careful." Anthony looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "Some people in this office don't like you," she said, glancing around as if afraid someone was listening. "They think you're a threat. I've heard them talking about you. Just watch your back." Anthony's grip tightened on his pen. He had known about the jealousy, but hearing it confirmed made it feel more real. "Thanks, Grace," he said. "I'll be careful." But he had no idea how serious the danger was. One night, long after most employees had left, a small group of people gathered in the dark corner of the office. Richard, Paul, and two others sat in hushed conversation. "We need to get rid of him," Richard said. "But how?" Paul asked. "He's too clean. The CEO trusts him." A smirk crossed Richard's face. "We don't need to ruin him physically. We just need to destroy his reputation. And I have the perfect plan." The others leaned in as Richard whispered his scheme. A plan that would frame Anthony for a crime he didn't commit. A plan that would turn his perfect life into a nightmare. Unaware of the betrayal brewing in the shadows, Anthony continued his work, never realizing that his downfall had already been set in motion. Anthony arrived at work early as usual. The air in Prestige Industries was crisp with the scent of fresh coffee, and the soft hum of the air conditioning filled the silent office. He placed his briefcase on the table and powered up his computer, ready to dive into the day's tasks. But something felt off. It wasn't just the occasional cold stares anymore. It was the way people whispered when he walked by. The way some of his colleagues avoided eye contact. He brushed it off, convincing himself it was nothing. But deep inside, unease settled like a stone in his stomach. The tension became more noticeable as days passed. Some files on his desk would mysteriously disappear and reappear hours later. His emails were being tampered with as if someone was monitoring his work. Then there were the rumors. "Did you hear?" A voice whispered near the water dispenser. "I heard Anthony's been getting special favors from the CEO." "Yeah," another voice replied. "Maybe that's how he keeps getting promoted." Anthony overheard it all, but he refused to react. He had worked too hard to let petty rumors get to him. However, things escalated when he noticed something strange with one of the company's financial records. One afternoon, while reviewing the monthly balance sheet, Anthony noticed a discrepancy. A large sum of money had been withdrawn, but there was no supporting document explaining the transaction. His brow furrowed. This wasn't normal. He traced the transaction back to an authorization document, one that bore his signature. But Anthony had never approved such a transaction. Panic shot through him. Someone had forged his signature. Someone had used his name to steal money from the company. He immediately stood up and hurried to Mr. Benson's office. "Sir, I found something strange in the financial records," Anthony said as he placed the file on the table. "There's a large withdrawal, but I never approved it. Someone forged my signature." Mr. Benson adjusted his glasses and studied the document. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. "This is serious," he said. "We need to report this to the CEO immediately." They rushed to Mr. Edwards' office. The CEO, an older man with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, took the document and examined it carefully. His face darkened. "Anthony," he said, his voice cold. "Are you saying you had nothing to do with this?" "Sir, I swear on my life I did not approve that transaction," Anthony said firmly. The CEO exhaled deeply. "Then how do you explain this? Your signature is right there." "I don't know how it got there," Anthony said. "But I would never betray this company. Someone is trying to frame me." Mr. Edwards' expression remained unreadable. "This is a serious accusation, Anthony. We cannot afford any fraud in this company. If you are guilty, you will face the consequences." Anthony felt his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the doubt in their eyes. "I understand, sir," he said. "All I ask is for a fair investigation." But before anyone could respond, the office door burst open. 2 police officers walked in. "Mr. Anthony, you are under arrest for financial fraud," one of them announced. Anthony's blood turned to ice. The office went silent. Employees gathered, whispering amongst themselves as Anthony stood frozen. "You have the wrong person," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't do this." "Tell it to the judge," the officer replied. "We have orders to detain you for questioning." Before he could protest further, cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. Anthony turned to Mr. Edwards. "Sir, please." But the CEO looked away. As Anthony was led through the office, he caught a glimpse of Richard and Paul standing in the crowd. Richard smirked. Paul pretended to look surprised, but Anthony saw the satisfaction in his eyes. It was them. They had set him up. The cold walls of the prison cell were nothing like the grand office he once worked in. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale food. Every night he lay on the hard bed replaying the moment of his arrest over and over. He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his freedom. His family and friends were in shock. Some believed him, others had doubts. The media had a field day painting him as a corporate thief. The worst part: the real culprits were still out there walking free. Each day in that cell, Anthony's anger grew. He was not just going to sit there and let them win. He needed to prove his innocence. But how? His only hope was that Prestige Industries would continue their investigation. And one day the truth would come out. 3 months later, on a stormy afternoon, the warden called out his name. "Anthony, you have a visitor." He sat up immediately, heart pounding. As he stepped into the visitor's room, he saw Mr. Benson and Grace sitting at the table. "Mr. Benson," Anthony gasped. "Please tell me there's news." Mr. Benson nodded, his face serious. "There is. The company reviewed CCTV footage from your office. We found something." Anthony leaned in, gripping the edge of the table. "What did you find?" Grace took a deep breath. "We saw how someone entered your office late at night. They used your computer and printed the forged documents. They planted everything to frame you." Anthony's hands clenched into fists. "Who was it?" he asked, voice low. Mr. Benson hesitated before speaking. "Richard." Pull. And he looked at Grace as if unsure whether to continue. And who? Anthony pressed. Grace swallowed hard. Linda. Anthony's eyes widened. Linda, the CEO's secretary. The one person who had access to all confidential files. She was involved too? Anthony whispered. Grace nodded. She was the one who placed the forged documents on your desk to make it look like you signed them. The pieces fell into place. The entire scheme had been carefully planned. They had studied his routine, knew his habits, and struck when the time was right. But now the truth was out. Mr. Benson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We showed the footage to Mr. Edwards. He knows the truth now. The police are arresting them as we speak. Anthony exhaled, feeling the weight of the past 3 months lifting off his chest. Anthony sat in his cold prison cell, staring at the damp walls. Even though Grace and Mr. Benson had brought good news, he was still behind bars. 3 months of suffering, shame, and frustration had changed him. He wasn't the same hopeful young man who had stepped into prestige industries full of dreams. He had lost everything: his job, his freedom, and his reputation. But now the truth was finally coming out. Would he really be free? Would he be able to rebuild his life? His thoughts were interrupted when the prison guard approached. Anthony, get up. You're being released. Anthony's heart skipped a beat. Released. The guard gave him a nod. The police found new evidence. The charges have been dropped. Anthony could hardly believe it. He slowly stood up, his hands trembling. Was this real? As Anthony walked out of the prison gates, the evening air hit his face, fresh and cool. He inhaled deeply, tasting freedom for the first time in months. Waiting outside was Mr. Benson, Grace, and, unexpectedly, Mr. Edwards, the CEO. Anthony's heart tightened at the sight of him. The man who had once praised him had also turned his back on him. Anthony, Mr. Edwards said, his voice low. I owe you an apology. Anthony stayed silent, his emotions a storm inside him. I was quick to judge, the CEO continued. I should have believed in you. I let my anger cloud my judgment. And for that I'm truly sorry. Anthony clenched his fists. He had spent months in prison because of a crime he didn't commit. The CEO had watched as he was dragged away without giving him the benefit of the doubt. But Anthony also knew that holding on to anger wouldn't help him move forward. He exhaled and nodded. I appreciate your apology, sir. Mr. Edwards looked relieved. I want you to return to Prestige Industries. We will compensate you for what you've lost. Anthony's eyes widened. You want me to go back? Mr. Benson placed a hand on his shoulder. You're one of the best accountants we've ever had. The company needs you. Anthony thought about it. Could he really walk back into that office after everything that had happened? Then he remembered something. Richard, Paul, Linda. The people who had done this to him. Where were they now? The next morning, Anthony stood outside the police station, watching as officers led 3 handcuffed figures into the building. Richard, Paul, Linda. Their faces were pale, their once arrogant expressions now replaced with fear. Anthony met Richard's eyes as he walked past. Richard smirked, but this time there was no confidence behind it. You got lucky, Richard muttered. No, Anthony replied. I got justice. Paul kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, while Linda, the CEO's secretary, had tears streaming down her face. I was forced into it, she said, looking at Anthony desperately. I didn't want to. Anthony turned away. He didn't need to hear her excuses. She had watched as he was arrested and sent to prison without a second thought. She had made her choice. The police officers led them away, and Anthony finally felt like he could breathe again. Walking back into Prestige Industries felt surreal. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. Employees whispered as he passed, but this time it wasn't out of jealousy. It was guilt. Some had believed the rumors about him. Some had spread them. Now they all knew the truth. When Anthony entered his office, he found a bouquet of flowers and a letter on his desk. It was from the CEO. Anthony, I hope you can forgive me. The company failed you, and we will do everything in our power to make it right. Welcome back. Anthony sighed and placed the letter down. He wasn't sure if things would ever be the same, but one thing was clear. He wasn't the weak, naive employee he once was. He had fought a battle and won. And from now on he would make sure no one ever tried to destroy him again. Anthony sat in his office at Prestige Industries, staring at the large window that overlooked the city. He had been back for a week now, but things still didn't feel normal. Yes, the real criminals had been caught. Yes, he had been proven innocent. And yes, he had even received a salary raise as compensation. But the scars of what had happened to him still lingered. People who once smiled at him now avoided his gaze out of shame. Some whispered apologies, others tried to pretend nothing had happened. But Anthony knew the truth. Most of them had doubted him when it mattered. And that was something he would never forget. Since the arrests of Richard, Paul, and Linda, the company had been in chaos. Employees were being questioned about what they knew. The finance department was being audited. The CEO had ordered an internal investigation to ensure no one else was involved. There was tension in the air and Anthony could feel it. One afternoon as he was going through reports, Grace knocked on his door. "Hey, can I come in?" "Of course," Anthony said, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry, Anthony. For everything." Anthony looked at her, confused. "Sorry for what?" Grace lowered her head. "I should have spoken up sooner. I knew Richard and Paul were up to something, but I was too scared to get involved. I thought, maybe if I stayed quiet things would sort themselves out." Anthony sighed. He couldn't blame her. He knew how dangerous office politics could be. "You did help me, Grace," he said. "If it weren't for you and Mr. Benson, I might still be in prison. But we could have stopped it before it got that far," she whispered, her voice heavy with guilt. "I should have done more." Anthony reached across the desk and patted her hand. "What matters is that the truth came out. And now we move forward." Grace nodded, relief flooding her face. "Thank you, Anthony. You're a good man." But just as she was about to leave, there was a commotion outside. Loud voices echoed through the hallway and Anthony quickly stood up. He and Grace stepped outside to see Mr. Edwards, the CEO, standing near the conference room, his face red with anger. "What is going on?" Anthony asked. Mr. Benson appeared beside them, his expression grim. "More evidence just came in." Anthony's stomach twisted. "More evidence?" Mr. Benson sighed. "Anthony, the corruption in this company goes deeper than we thought." Before Anthony could ask anything else, the CEO turned to the gathered employees and spoke. "Listen up, everyone," Mr. Edwards said, his voice filled with frustration. "The internal investigation has uncovered something shocking. Richard and Paul were just the tip of the iceberg. There were others involved." Mr. Benson stepped forward, holding a folder. "We have reason to believe that someone high up in the company helped cover up the fraud. Someone who protected them." Anthony's heart pounded. "Who?" Mr. Benson opened the folder and handed a document to Mr. Edwards, who read it aloud. "Mr. Johnson, the Vice President of Finance, has been found guilty of covering up fraudulent transactions. He knew about Richard and Paul's plan and allowed it to happen in exchange for a cut of the stolen money." More gasps filled the office. Employees whispered in shock. Anthony clenched his fists. Mr. Johnson was one of the top executives. He had worked in prestige industries for years. No one had suspected him. Just then, security guards entered and walked straight to Mr. Johnson's office. Moments later, they dragged him out in handcuffs. "This is ridiculous," Mr. Johnson shouted. "I am innocent." But the evidence was undeniable. The audit team had found proof, emails, hidden bank transactions, and forged documents, all pointing to him. Anthony watched as the man struggled, but there was no escaping justice. One by one, all those who had conspired against him were falling. That evening, after the chaos had settled, Anthony sat in the CEO's office. Mr. Edwards looked tired, his usual confidence shaken. "This company was almost destroyed from the inside," he said. "And I was blind to it." Anthony remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I misjudged you, Anthony. I failed you. And for that, I don't just owe you an apology, I owe you my gratitude." Anthony frowned. "Gratitude?" Mr. Edwards nodded. "If it weren't for you, this corruption might have continued for years. You exposed the cracks in this company. You showed us the truth." Anthony took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how to respond. He had once admired Mr. Edwards, looked up to him. But when things got tough, the CEO had abandoned him. "I want you to stay, Anthony," Mr. Edwards said. "And not just as an accountant. I want to promote you. I need people like you in leadership, people I can trust." Anthony's eyes widened. "You want to promote me?" "Yes," Mr. Edwards said. You have proven yourself to be one of the most loyal, hardworking employees this company has ever had. Prestige Industries needs someone with your integrity." Anthony hesitated. Could he accept this? After everything he had been through, could he really stay in a company that had once thrown him away so easily? He looked at Mr. Edwards and saw something he hadn't seen before: genuine remorse. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to rebuild Prestige Industries into something better. Anthony nodded slowly. "All right, sir. I accept." A relieved smile spread across Mr. Edwards' face. "You won't regret this, Anthony." A week later, Anthony stood in his new office. His nameplate on the desk now read, Anthony Alfred, Senior Financial Manager. It was a new position, a new responsibility, but more importantly, it was a new beginning. He knew there would still be challenges ahead. Not everyone would be happy with his rise in the company. But one thing was certain. He would never let anyone take advantage of him again. He had fought his battle. And he had won. Anthony sat in his new office, his hands resting on the sleek wooden desk. The golden letters on his nameplate gleamed under the soft office light. Anthony Alfred, Senior Financial Manager. It had been a long, painful road to this moment. The betrayal, the false accusations, the prison walls. Everything he had endured felt like a distant nightmare. Yet the scars remained. He had returned to Prestige Industries not because he forgave everyone, but because he wanted to change things. To ensure that no one else would suffer the way he had. But power came with enemies. And Anthony knew that not everyone was happy about his return. Though most of the employees now treated him with respect, Anthony could still sense resentment lurking in the corridors. Some people whispered behind his back. Others avoided him altogether. He understood why. His promotion had shaken the company. Many believed he should have left after what happened. Others envied his rise, thinking he had gained favor with the CEO. But Anthony had no time for office politics. His first task was to rebuild trust in the finance department. The corruption scandal had damaged the company's reputation, and many investors were pulling away. It was up to him to restore order. One morning, as Anthony was reviewing reports, Mr. Benson entered his office. "Anthony, we have a problem," he said, his face grim. Anthony sighed, setting down his pen. "What now?" Mr. Benson placed a file on the desk. "Someone has been leaking internal financial information to our competitors." Anthony's jaw tightened. "Do we know who?" "Not yet," Mr. Benson admitted. "But if we don't stop it soon, Prestige Industries could suffer another financial hit." Anthony knew this was no coincidence. Someone wanted to sabotage the company. And more importantly, they wanted to see him fail. Anthony spent the next few days carefully monitoring transactions and communication logs. He worked late into the night, determined to find the leak. Then one evening he found something suspicious. A series of emails had been sent to an unknown external address. Emails that contained sensitive financial data. The sender? Grace. Anthony's heart pounded in his chest. Grace? The same woman who had helped prove his innocence? No. It couldn't be. But the evidence was right there. He needed proof before taking action. That night, instead of going home, Anthony stayed in the office, watching from the shadows as employees packed up to leave. Then he saw her. Grace walked cautiously down the hallway, glancing over her shoulder. Instead of heading to the exit, she slipped into the records room. Anthony followed quietly, keeping his distance. Through the small glass window, he saw her pull out a USB drive and plug it into a company computer. A wave of disappointment crashed over him. He was the hiding traitor. The next morning, Anthony called Grace into his office. She walked in, smiling slightly as if nothing was wrong. "You wanted to see me?" she asked. Anthony leaned back in his chair. "Yes. I have a question for you." Grace tilted her head. "What is it?" Anthony slid a printed copy of the leaked emails across the desk. "Can you explain this?" Grace's smile faltered. Her face went pale. She started, but no words came out. "Last night I saw you accessing confidential files," Anthony continued. "I trusted you, Grace. And now I find out that you're selling company secrets." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Anthony, you don't understand. I didn't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," he said coldly. Grace took a shaky breath. "After Richard and Paul were arrested, I started receiving threats. Someone called me and said that if I didn't send them information, they would ruin my career. They had evidence that she stopped herself. Anthony's eyes narrowed. Evidence of what? Grace swallowed hard. I knew about Richard and Paul's fraud long before you were framed. I saw things, I overheard conversations, but I never reported it. I was scared. If they exposed that, I would have been fired too. Anthony sighed. So you chose to betray the company to save yourself? Tears slipped down her cheeks. I regret it, Anthony. But I didn't know what else to do. Anthony stared at her for a long moment. He knew the pain of being accused of something. He knew the fear of losing everything. But he also knew the importance of integrity. Grace, I can't cover this up, he said firmly. Grace lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. I understand, Anthony. I deserve whatever happens. Anthony felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, disappointment, and something close to pity. He had trusted Grace. She had helped him when he was at his lowest. But trust, once broken, was hard to repair. He picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Edwards' number. Sir, I need you to come to my office. It's urgent. Minutes later, Mr. Edwards and Mr. Benson arrived. Anthony looked at Grace one last time before turning to them. We found the leak. Mr. Edwards' face darkened. Who? Anthony exhaled and gestured toward Grace. It was her. Mr. Edwards' eyes widened, and Mr. Benson shook his head in disbelief. Grace, is this true? Mr. Edwards demanded. She nodded, tears still in her eyes. Sir. She broke off, unable to continue. Mr. Edwards sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. I don't believe this. After everything we've been through, another betrayal. Anthony watched Grace, waiting to see if she would try to save herself. But she didn't. She stood there, defeated, accepting her fate and ready to face whatever punishment she had to receive for the offense she committed. Mr. Edwards finally spoke. Grace, you will have to face the consequences. You will be terminated immediately, and we will decide if further legal action is necessary. Grace nodded. I understand. Anthony looked at her one last time, feeling no hatred, only regret. I hope you learn from this, Grace. Not every mistake can be undone. With that, security was called and Grace was escorted out of the office. The storm had passed. The last traitor had been removed. And now, Prestige Industries could finally move forward. As Anthony sat in his office later that evening, watching the city lights through the window, he reflected on everything that had happened and all that he had gone through to get to this stage. He had walked into this company as a young, hopeful accountant. He had faced jealousy, betrayal, and imprisonment. He had seen people he trusted turn against him. But he had also discovered his strength. He had fought for justice and won. He had risen from the ashes. And now, as senior financial manager, he had the power to ensure that Prestige Industries became a place of integrity. A place where no one else would suffer the way he had. Anthony took a deep breath, a small smile forming on his lips. His battle was over. But his journey had just begun. As he leaned back in his chair, he realized something important. He was no longer just a survivor, he was a fighter. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew he had the strength to overcome them. Because in the end, integrity always wins.